banners still hang in every ruin. Every child still learns the names of men who never bled. I used to whisper those names before sleep, believing the Emperor's angels walked among us. Then I saw one land. I watched a space marine save a world once, or at least that's what the story said afterward. I was there when it happened. I saw what saving looks like up close. It's not light descending from the heavens. It's fire, smoke, and silence where voices used to be. They arrived late enough to be dramatic and early enough to claim the kill. The Vox was a bruise of panicked traffic. My platoon was 4 men and a prayer lighter than ash, and the manufactorum sprawl ahead of us had become a maze of ruptured pressure lines and heretic Vox sirens. But the Thunderhawks still cut the cloud like red script on parchment. Angels of death, the sergeant muttered, though I'd watched enough worlds die to know angels never bothered with ration lines. Their drop pods hit with that theatrical, cathedral bell slam, and a moment later the air tasted of propellant and sanctified arrogance. We'd held the hab stacks for 9 days with lasguns that tickled armor and a commissar who loved speeches more than survivors. The Astartes, the word itself carried years of scholar progenium reverence, walked through the smoke like answers. Except answers don't shove you aside to pose for the hololith. A captain in cobalt lamella surveyed the carnage and spoke without looking at us, as if guard were set dressing that persisted between set pieces. Compliance, he said, and the word sounded like a verdict. He pointed toward the hab, block where our last civilians were barricaded, families who'd fled the cultists when the sirens began, and I watched his helm's eye lenses flare as if some internal catechism had just been satisfied. Compliance, he repeated, and 4 of his brothers fanned out in that perfect doctrinal wedge we'd been told could turn back a tyrannid tide. Then the bolters started, not at the heretic gun nests, at the hab block. He called it a purity sweep, I called it an execution. Listen closely, a bolt round doesn't simply kill, it arrives like a decree and departs as shrapnel scripture, bursting flesh into a lesson you'll remember until you drown in it. We'd spent a week pulling children from utility ducts, cataloging them like precious ammunition, shepherding them beneath plasteel tables as the cult's stubbers hammered prayer into concrete. We had names for them. Lisa with the cracked front tooth, who wrote the Imperial Creed phonetically in suit. Peter, who never took off his father's auspex because it beeped quietly like a heartbeat. The Astartes had a name for them too, collateral. The Codex Astartes, intoned the captain when I interposed my lasgun like a twig before a storm, does not support hesitation in the face of contamination vectors. He quoted the book as if the book bled for him. I remember the exact motion, his gauntlet nudging my barrel down, polite as a confessor, then the chainblade coughing once and the door giving way in a shower of splinters and whispers. The screaming wasn't cinematic. It was wet and unheroic and far too human for the myth that followed. I'm not Nava about war. I've seen orcs treat cities like drums. I've watched a Necron harvest scythe take a squad apart as neatly as if it were slicing fruit. But the thing about Xeno's horrors is they never pretend to be your savior. Space Marines arrive wrapped in liturgy that sells absolution by the bolt. You learn the phrases as a child: demi-gods, angelic patriarchs, the emperors will made flesh. What you're not taught is how often chapters play at Empire, building with a Rosarius in one fist and Orna in the other. I've fought beside Black Templars who treated entire regiments as ballast for their zeal. I've watched a space wolf snarl down a governor for cowardice, because the man suggested evacuating civvies before the raise and salt. I've seen ultramarines stage a victory sermon on a daze constructed from our ammo crates, while my medica begged for blood bags. The myth says the Astartes are humanity perfected. The record says they're a weaponized myth that demands a tithe from reality. There's a rhythm to the lie. It begins with the thunder of retros and ends with an administratum scribe chiseling a devotional plaque that turns our dead into footnotes. The middle is where you find the rot. Watch how logistics bend around a chapter banner. We begged for macro shells for 3 weeks, a strike cruiser translates in, and suddenly the orbital grid sings like a choir. Not for us, for them. Their munitions caches bloom across our staging fields like cathedrals we aren't allowed to enter, guarded by servitors stamped with chapter sigils as proprietary as guild brands. You learn to understand the economy of worship, A single Astartes gauntlet is worth a platoon's worth of medkits. A single chainsword can barter for priority evac while guardsmen with names become aggregate loss. This isn't heresy. It's procurement. They call themselves chapters, families bound by gene, seed and catechism. I call them principalities. Consider the Badab War, chapters carving each other into legends while hive worlds paid the tithe in blood. Consider the Carcharodon's recruitment drives that look suspiciously like terror campaigns. Consider how many worlds call their governor Chapter Thrall, with a smile that doesn't reach their eyes. You think this is about tactics? It's about narrative control. Astartes are not simply soldiers. They're a brand the Imperium invests in, because the brand sells hope more cleanly than the truth. That the Astra Militarum dies by the billion so that a few demi-gods can stride through smoke at golden hour. Do they win wars? Yes. The bolt gun is an argument even a heretic understands. Astartes' assault doctrine can crack a rebellion like a nut. Their hypno-indoctrination forges cohesion a commissar can only dream of. But ask yourself, how many wars do they win that they've made unwinnable for anyone else? We dig in. We sweat trench lines into the earth. We learn a city's throat and choke points by inhaling its dust. And when the Astartes arrive, they treat the accumulated nuance of human survival like clutter to be cleared for the set piece. The Codex says shock and awe. The Morgi ledgers say shattered supply chains, burned hab grids and population centers written off because a brother, sergeant felt a flamer would preach more cleanly than a vox appeal. The bolter is not a scalpel, but it's wielded like the only instrument worth playing, and yet something worse grows beneath the admiration, a kind of dependency, a quiet surrender of responsibility wrapped in gratitude. The belief that without the Astartes we'd all be lost. Maybe we are. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the Imperium built gods to hide its own failures, and we kept praying because it was easier than admitting we were never worth saving. I thought of that the night they left. The Thunderhawks lifting off in perfect formation, the glow of their retros reflecting off the burning habs they'd just purified. Their vox channels sang litanies of victory. Our vox carried the sound of children coughing. That was the night I stopped believing in angels. But faith doesn't die cleanly. It festers, it mutters in your blood. And months later, when I found myself staring at the corpse of another world, saved by another chapter, I started wondering, if this is what salvation looks like, what does damnation even mean? And that's when I met the ones who had an answer. The first time I saw a Tau, I almost fired on instinct. The old training dies hardest, the reflex to equate alien with corruption, heretic with other. But my last gun was out of charge, and I was out of courage. The war zone around me was already more corpse than city. The air tasted like old promethium and rusted faith. The imperial banners that hadn't burned yet hung limp, stiff with soot and blood. The Vox was dead. I was alone, until they found me. They didn't come in glory or with sermons. No thunderhawks, no hymns, no retinues reciting catechisms about purity or compliance. Just a small escort drone humming low, cautious, like it wasn't sure whether I was animal or artifact. Behind it walked a figure in clean armor the color of dawn. Not gold, not black, not the metallic arrogance of a Astartes plate. Soft gray trimmed in white. Its lines were geometric, efficient comp. Everything about it felt wrong for a battlefield. No skulls, no wings, no scripture, just design. It didn't point a weapon at me. It tilted its head slightly, as if waiting for a sign I still belonged to the living. I expected the typical Xenos mockery, some alien sneer about mankind's decay. Instead, it spoke through a translator drone in a voice calm enough to make my hands shake. "You're wounded," it said. "We can help." Help, I almost laughed. That word had been stripped of meaning centuries ago. The Imperium doesn't help, it purges, it cleanses, it redeems. Everything wrapped in holy euphemism for annihilation. I'd heard help before. From Medicare who injected morphine instead of cure, from commissars who offered forgiveness at gunpoint, from chaplains who said pain was proof of devotion. But this creature meant it. The Tor didn't drag me, didn't disarm me, didn't quote doctrine. It simply offered me a ration pack and waited. For the first time since the Hab Purge, silence didn't feel like accusation. They took me into their camp that night. No icons, no burning incense, no vox prayers. The walls weren't plastered with faces of dead saints, just clean panels of modular alloy and faint blue light. The med techs didn't chant, they just worked, fast, quiet, efficient. When I woke, my burns were sealed, my lungs cleared of ash. I expected interrogation. Instead, they asked questions that felt human. What did you believe the Imperium wanted? What did you think it gave you in return? What did you hope to save? I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because I realized I didn't know anymore. In the Imperium, questions like those are heresy, the kind of heresy that gets you re-educated with a bolt round. But here, they weren't accusations. They were curiosities. It unsettled me more than any daemon ever had, because daemons want your soul. The Tor wanted my reason. Their commander came to see me the next morning, tall for their kind, calm as a glacier. His armor bore a sigil shaped like a rising circle, their symbol for the greater good. I'd seen it stamped on corpses before. The ecclesiarchy said it was a lie, propaganda for heretics. But seeing it there, carved with mathematical precision into living metal, it didn't look like deceit. It looked like conviction. He asked me my name. When I gave it, he nodded and said, "You fought well. No sanctimony, no talk of penance or destiny, just recognition." I asked him what the greater good really was. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile you make when you know the answer can't be taught in one sentence. "The greater good," he said, "is the opposite of what you were taught to die for. It is not obedience, it is cooperation." I didn't believe him, but I wanted to, because belief is a habit, and I was starving for something to replace the old one. He didn't press. He simply gestured toward the horizon, where Tor drones floated silently, rebuilding what had been our manufactorum. They weren't erecting shrines. They weren't consecrating rubble. They were repairing water lines, bringing light back to hab blocks. I'd never seen that after an imperial liberation. Our victories always ended in fire. Theirs ended in rebuilding. Still, the indoctrination clawed at me. The ecclesiarchy's whispers echoed Xenos lies, seductive heresies. The kind of compassion that hides infection. I kept waiting for the trap, for the daemon hidden behind the civility, for the horror to reveal itself. But days passed, and no one preached, no one purged, no one demanded I kneel. The Toe didn't even mention the Emperor. They just worked, efficiently, together, without ego, without blood banners. And that was the horror, because I realized what I was seeing wasn't chaos, it was order. Not the kind hammered into submission by fear, but order chosen, sustained by shared belief. The kind the Imperium always claimed to have. I found myself helping, just simple things, lifting panels, recalibrating conduits, translating damage reports. I told myself it was survival instinct, but it wasn't, it was relief. The absence of cruelty feels like mercy when you've lived under devotion's whip. One night, sitting beneath a half-repaired relay tower, I overheard two tall Earth-cast engineers debating supply metrics. One mentioned how much human equipment they could salvage. The other replied that it wasn't just metal they wanted to save, it was us. "Humans can learn," she said. "They only need to stop worshipping their pain." That sentence didn't leave me. Worshipping our pain. The Imperium trains us to call it faith. The Tor call it waste. I didn't know which sounded worse. And then came the first test. A distress signal from the edge of the sector. A surviving Imperial detachment, trapped, requesting reinforcement. The Tor commander offered to send aid. Not troops, not warriors. Supplies, medicine, evac ships. I watched him draft the transmission in calm, neutral tones. The Imperial Vox officer on the other end hesitated, then replied, "We don't take help from Xenos." The commander didn't argue. He just nodded and signed off. I asked him why he didn't insist. He looked at me with something like sadness. Because they would rather die faithful than live free. The words hurt more than they should have. Because they weren't wrong. That night, I dreamed of terror. The shining throne I'd once prayed toward felt distant now, more cage than beacon. The Emperor's light, the Astronomican's glow, all of it seemed less divine, more like the flare of a dying star. The next morning, I found myself tracing the Tau symbol in the dust with my finger before wiping it away in shame. That's when I realized I was losing something, and gaining something else. Faith doesn't vanish overnight. It fractures quietly until one day you wake up and realize the cracks form a doorway. And on the other side stands something that doesn't need your worship to survive. That's where the Tor waited, and when they offered me a place among them, I didn't say yes, But I didn't say no either, because somewhere deep down, I knew if the Imperium ever found this place, they'd call it heresy. They'd burn it to ash. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure which side I'd stand on when they did, because I'd seen how gods save and how others simply choose to build instead. The smoke never lifts right after a battle. It clings to the lungs, to the teeth, to the soul. We were told that standing beside the Astartes was to stand beside living saints, but what I saw that day looked nothing like salvation. The ground was a mosaic of ash and armor shards, a mural painted in failure. The Marines moved through it as if walking through a cathedral built from corpses. No emotion, no hesitation, just the cold rhythm of purpose. A chaplain's voice echoed through the ruin, a sermon more mechanical than divine. Each word carried through his vox grill with the precision of a machine repeating doctrine it no longer believed. He spoke of purity, of duty, of the Emperor's endless mercy. And behind him, a Marine drove his gauntlet into a wounded heretic's chest. Slow, deliberate, surgical, mercy. That word didn't mean anything anymore. The world stank of cooked flesh and unspent fear. I remember watching one of them, a giant with crimson pauldrons blackened by soot, kneel before a fallen brother. The dead one's armor was split, his face exposed. He couldn't have been older than me before the transformation. Just a boy carved into something divine and then shattered by the weight of it. The living Marine took his helm, wiped the blood from its lenses, and placed it beside the body like a candle on an altar. Then he stood, turned, and walked away. No prayer, no acknowledgement of the rest of us still breathing. To him, the battle wasn't over. It just wasn't interesting anymore. That was the first time I realized how small we really were to them. The Commissar had once told me the Space Marines were proof of the Emperor's love. His chosen sons, pure and unbreakable. But what kind of father builds children only to feed them to endless war? What kind of God demands purity at the expense of empathy? The answer is the same one that fills every trench in the Imperium, the kind that fears imperfection more than extinction. When the silence came, it wasn't peace, it was judgment. The Astartes gathered their dead, loaded them into transports, and without a word to the thousands of guardsmen who'd bled for the same patch of dirt, they left. Their engines roared like dying stars, and we stood there watching our saviors vanish into the clouds. None of them looked back. The Vox crackled later that night. Command's message was clear. The Emperor's angels have delivered victory. All surviving mortal units to consolidate and await further orders. That was it. No acknowledgement, no names, no humanity. Just numbers written in the ledger of obedience. We buried what we could. The rest became ash in the wind. Somewhere between digging and praying. I started to wonder if the Emperor ever noticed how quiet it had become down here. There's a saying among guardsmen, the Astartes are what happens when faith forgets compassion. I used to laugh at that. Now it sounds like prophecy. One of the younger troopers, a boy barely old enough to shave, asked me what the Marines were like up close. He'd never seen one before. I told him they were perfect. That was supposed to be a comfort. But I saw how his eyes dimmed when I said it. Perfection doesn't inspire, it devours. It tells you that no matter how much you bleed, you'll never be enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. The campfire burned low, casting long shadows over the faces of men who'd stopped dreaming months ago. The stars above flickered through the smog like dying candles. Somewhere out there, those giants were already en route to their next holy war, and I wondered if they even remembered the world they'd just saved. Because the thing about Space Marines, the thing no one says aloud, is that they don't build, they erase. Every victory leaves behind a silence that feels too deliberate, too clean, like they're scrubbing the galaxy of anything that might remind them they were once human. The next morning, I found one of their relics half buried in the dirt, a broken Aquila emblem, cracked down the middle. On the back, etched so finely I almost missed it, were words in high Gothic, "Only the dead are perfect." It hit harder than I wanted it to. Later, when the new orders came through, redeployment to some other nameless world, I saw the same Marine ship pass overhead, the same sigil, the same roar, the same promise of deliverance that never quite reached the ground, and in that thunder I thought I heard something else. Not glory, not faith, just exhaustion. The Marines keep fighting because they can't stop. The Imperium keeps worshipping because it can't think. And the rest of us, we just keep surviving because we're too afraid not to. That's when it started to click. Maybe the Space Marines aren't the Emperor's chosen. Maybe they're his punishment, walking reminders of what happens when humanity trades empathy for efficiency. Machines of faith with hearts full of silence. They call it purity. I call it rot. The kind that starts at the soul and spreads outward until everything beautiful turns sterile. I used to believe they were humanity's defenders. Now I think they're its containment unit, the lock on the coffin lid of our potential. The wind picked up, carrying the ash of our dead across the camp. It looked almost beautiful in the morning light. Almost. I watched it swirl and vanish, and for a moment, I understood why people worship destruction. It's the only thing that never disappoints. The boy who'd asked about the Marines stood beside me, staring at the horizon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I could see the question in his eyes. If they're what we're supposed to become, why does it feel so wrong? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know anymore. Somewhere in orbit, the Astartes were probably already kneeling in prayer, thanking the Emperor for another victory. Maybe they even meant it. Maybe they still believed. But down here on the ground, where the mud still smelled of blood and the prayers had turned to whispers, I felt something else rising, something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Doubt. It crept in quietly, like a crack forming beneath a cathedral floor, small at first, harmless. But every empire starts dying the moment someone dares to ask a question, and I was about to ask mine. Because if the Emperor's angels are truly perfect, why do they leave so much ruin in their wake? And if perfection demands this much death, what would happen to the galaxy the day they finally lose a war? They did lose once, or close enough that the galaxy flinched. Not the famous catastrophes comms likes to shelve as necessary withdrawals, but a small, ugly failure no one will sing about. It happened on Thramis Gate, a mining hunk wrapped in dust and prayer, where the administratum bled tithers out of rock and hope. Our regiment was there to hold a tramway choke while an Astartes strike force cracked the heretic bastion ahead. We were told it would be swift, surgical, because the angels were leading. The strike cruiser hung above us like a floating cathedral, its launch bays glowing with promise. The Vox washed us in litanies. We believed enough to load the last of our courage into the breach and wait for the thunder that meant, "You can stop dying now." The thunder came late. Then wrong. The bastion's curtain wall didn't fall to drop, pods and crack precision. It tumbled in ragged plumes after a full hour of counter, barrage that should never have landed at all. When the Astartes finally hit ground, they did it in the open, framed by their own descending fire as if staging a mural. It was beautiful for 3 seconds. Then the traitors cut the landing zone in half with a mining laser mounted on a crane, and the mural turned into a crematorium. Angels tumbled like iron statuary. The survivors pivoted, reformed, and advanced with that inexorable Astartes cadence that looks like inevitability until the world forgets to obey. The crane didn't. The laser took another bite. We listened on Vox to a sergeant invoke a dozen oaths while his squad shouted range and bearings, and then silence where there should have been fury. The chaplain filled the gap with doctrine. It didn't staunch the bleeding. Command told us to hold the choke and conserve ammunition. The angels will break their back, came the line, cold as ration paste. We stared across a strip of slag and watched the impossible flail toward possible by sheer force of identity. They were Space Marines, and Space Marines don't fail. They say it often enough that reality usually nods. Thramis Gate didn't nod. It kept sober books. Every time an Astartes broke a line, the enemy flexed around them like muscle around a needle, and the wound closed. Once, a tactical squad vaulted a trench with acrobatic ease and vanished into a fog of promethium smoke on the far side. When the smoke drifted, the trench still held. None of this was strategic genius from the heretics. It was stubborn terrain and uglier math. The sort of fight guard win with shovels, backup plans, and the permission to be imperfect. I saw it in one helmet cam feed, the moment the myth cracked. A captain, midnight, blue plate lacquered with devotional script, stood inside the ruins of a loading bay, bolt pistol smoking, chainsword idling like a growl in his palm. He had that voice they teach in the gene, seed dreamscapes, the one that turns orders into gravity. "Forward," he said, and then a mortar shell fell 2 meters short, throwing powdered ferrocrete into the cam in a dirty blizzard. The view steadied. A surf servitor wheeled up the portable banner, teeth chattering through its muzzle, and the captain pushed it upright. The data stream tagged him as on board. The next shell landed on the flag. When the lens cleared this time, the captain's helm was turned toward the camera, just enough to show the shake in his breath. He didn't retreat. He retook the exact same step as if rewinding an icon. He thought being who he was would make the world remember how it's supposed to work. When the Vox layer fell back enough for us to hear each other again, Sergeant Bray asked the question no one is allowed to voice. What's plan B for angels? The platoon lieutenant did not answer. He stared at the sky like an acolyte waiting for a miracle he's read about his whole life. I watched the sky too, because I wanted to be wrong. I wanted the second wave to erase the first like chalk under rain. Instead, we got to read task guard elements were to push to contact and exploit Astartes' breach. There was no breach. There was a corridor made of bodies that kept trying to be a corridor out of sheer discipline. We went anyway. That's guard logic. If the hole doesn't exist, become the hole. The tramway smelled of rust and sour lubricant. Shotcrete walls sweated condensation and old incense. We moved low and ugly, the way men do when the sky has stopped pretending to love them. The enemy fire didn't track us at first, too busy punching at towering silhouettes further on. We slid into an alcove where the plating peeled like bark and found 3 angels. 2 dead. 1 sitting up in the rubble holding his own left arm by the bicep like a drop tool. His vambrace still clutched a bolt pistol. His bare face looked younger than the paint on my last gun. He glanced at our flak like it offended him, then at the enemy lines, then at the missing half of himself. He stood. To me, he said, as if the universe were a well-trained hound. Negative, Bray told him, because Bray had already decided coming home mattered more than becoming a legend. We'll go around, cut the crane power, blind their line. The Marine frowned. A child told bedtime early. Honor demands, he started. Bray shoved a det cord spool into my hands, pointed at the utility duct, and said, Honor demands someone live long enough to remember this. We went into the dark while a demi-god tried to reconstruct his ritual in the open. The duct stank like water rats and betrayal. We crawled toward the substation, and I thought about how many times I'd heard that Astartes are the scalpel, and we are the hammer. It's a flattering lie. They are the statue. We are the scaffolding that keeps getting rebuilt beneath it, and when the statue falls, someone sends a new blueprint and more wood. When we reached the substation, the enemy had left a 4-man team and a cross-wired mess on the panel. They expected superhuman confidence to come charging, not tired humans who check fuses because mistakes are how we breathe. Bray killed the power to the crane and half the trench lamps besides. The battlefield exiled. Shadows reasserted themselves in the Marine's favor. For 5 minutes, the angels looked again like the poems say, moving shapes in fog, precise and surgical. For 6 minutes it worked. Then the enemy pivoted to heat signatures and the fog stopped mattering. Back at the tramway, we found the one armed Marine on his knees. He had dragged 2 of his dead into a saint's tableau and was arranging them to face the right direction. His severed arm lay beside him like a rebuke. He looked up at me as if expecting a benediction I don't know how to give. The crane, he asked. Down, I said. You can advance. He nodded once, dignified to the point of parody, and pushed himself to his feet. Bray touched my elbow and tilted his head toward a side stair. We took it without saying why. There's a moment in every battle where pride insists on a direction and experience takes another. I chose experience. The Marine chose pride. He walked back into scripture, and the scripture devoured him. Here's the other thing about losses. The Imperium hides them in language first. Tactical reallocation. Operational pause. Redeployment to favorable ground. The angels bled out of Thramis Gate under the softest words a hard empire can make. The crane stayed down. The trench changed hands twice. The bastion flags fluttered, then froze. When the strike cruiser finally burned high and away, the Vox played a prayer so beautiful it almost made sense of what we'd seen. Almost. We held the choke a night longer, then were told our courage had preserved strategic options. I wrote 2 names into the list of the dead that weren't on my roster. Brother, Sergeant unnamed. Captain unnamed. They deserved at least the dignity of being counted by the people they never saw. After, in the mess, I watched the boy who used to ask questions stare at the metal table like it might answer anyway. "They can lose," he said, voice a scraped out bowl. "They can actually lose." I wanted to tell him that's fine, that everyone loses, that failure is the cost of being real. But the truth is, Space Marines aren't built to lose. They're built to refuse the premise. When defeat arrives, and it always arrives, because reality doesn't care about catechism. It breaks something in them the codices don't have glue for. That's why the chaplains roar so loud, not to inspire, to drown out the sound of hairline fractures becoming gulfs. If this were just about one gate and one crane, it would be petty. It isn't. It's about design. The Astartes are engineered for iconic moments, boarding actions, last stands, the cinematic pivot where a 10,000-year story demands a single, photogenic answer. But the Imperium's real war is fought in the long rot where nothing ends and everything leaks. In the slough of perpetual maintenance. In the grimy places where heroes are liabilities because the problem won't flinch when a hero shouts. We need people who can sandbag a river that never stops rising, not statues that look good in the flood. You want engagement, rage. Ask yourself how many miracles the angels siphon out of the guard just by standing there. How many times a mortal regiment dies to protect an image rather than a plan. We're told the Astartes are humanity perfected. I think their humanity paused, permanently locked at the age where certainty feels like virtue. They don't bend, they break decoratively. On the shuttle up, I sat across from a Marine in black and bone, a skull icon glaring from his pauldron. He stared at the bulkhead like it owed him an apology. His gauntlets were bloodless. Someone had already polished him back into myth. I caught my reflection in the ceramite, smoke, streaked, exhausted, alive, and wondered which of us the Imperium valued more. The answer came cold and obvious, the one they can parade. The one who doesn't ask for anything they don't already offer. The one who won't ever say, no. Back on orbit. The after-action summary called Thramis Gate, a demonstration of Astartes' fortitude under adverse conditions. That's how you salt a battlefield and call it a garden. The boy read the line twice and laughed without sound. Bray signed the acknowledgement with a pen that had outlived 3 commissars. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the captain's shaking breath, not to mock him, to honor the only human thing I saw in him all day. Maybe that's the worst of it. When the angels finally look human, it's because they've been forced to. And the moment passes. So here's the cliff edge we're all standing on, whether we admit it or not. If the Imperium's golden boys can't win the slow wars, the muddy ones, the ones without theatrics, then who exactly are we depending on to keep the lights flickering? If the answer is, no one, but keep believing, then the Empire's greatest weapon isn't ceramite or gene seed. It's denial. And denial doesn't kill enemies, it breeds them. We broke Atmo toward the next assignment, the shuttle rattling like a prayer wheel. The pilot piped a hymn through the tinny overhead to keep our hands from shaking. It didn't work. Outside the porthole, the strike cruiser's running lights stitched a perfect line through the dark, unbothered by our turbulence, separate as ever. I felt the question rise again, heavier this time, loaded with everything Thramis taught me, and everything the catechisms never will. What happens to a civilization when its icons can no longer carry its weight? And the rank and file finally noticed the strain. They told us the Astartes didn't break. They told us that when mortals faltered, the angels stood tall, unmoved by despair or doubt. But whoever wrote that line never watched one hesitate. I did, and it ruined something in me that I haven't been able to rebuild since. We were deployed to Vask's Reach 3 months after Thramis. The official report called it a cleansing action. It was supposed to be quick, contained, just another minor uprising in a manufactorum city that had forgotten how to kneel. The Astartes came down first. 3 squads of ultramarines, the kind propaganda slates carve into cathedral walls, armor polished, banners flying, their presence alone enough to make a regiment feel small. But by the end of that week, none of it mattered. Because you can't cleanse a city that's already dead. The manufactorums had gone quiet long before we landed. The air reeked of oil and rust. Servitors twitched in their alcoves, their hymnal programming looping endlessly over static. The civilians had vanished into the sublevels, hiding like rats from both sides. Every corridor echoed with the same mechanical breath, machines still working out of habit, long after purpose had fled. The Marines moved through it like they were retracing old scripture, each step deliberate, each formation immaculate. They didn't look alive in that place. They looked like statues searching for a cathedral that no longer existed. When we reached the central assembly hall, the floor was littered with banners, the same imperial aquila that used to fly above every worker's post. Someone had painted a single phrase across the marble in black ash. "He does not answer." The captain read it aloud. Then he ordered it burned. I watched the flame crawl up the letters, devouring the words as if the truth itself were heresy. The heat licked at his armor but didn't mark it. Nothing ever marks them. The first contact came from below, a worker enclave turned militia. They fought like people who had already made peace with dying. Frag grenades, scavenged las carbines, their leader shouting curses in low Gothic through a rebreather mask. The Astartes moved in with mechanical grace, suppressing fire with perfect arcs. But for every rebel they killed, two more emerged. It wasn't skill that slowed the angels, it was confusion. They weren't used to enemies who believed in something other than fear. By the second night, the city's power grid had collapsed. Fires lit the skyline in flickering halos. Our auspex showed no centralized command, no traitor marines, no warp anomalies. Just thousands of civilians fighting back. And in the middle of that chaos, the captain hesitated. He stood at the base of a broken statue, the Emperor's likeness shattered from the waist up. His bolt gun hung by his side. The Vox crackled in his ear. Another sergeant demanded authorization for an orbital strike to restore order. The captain didn't respond. For the first time, I saw his eyes through the helmet lenses. Not rage, not zeal, but something worse. Recognition. He'd seen this before. I realized then that the angels didn't fight heresy because they hated it. They fought it because they understood it too well. Every world they burned was just another reflection of what they'd become. Humanity reduced to obedience, stripped of curiosity, living only to survive under the weight of someone else's perfection. When the orbital strike finally came, it wasn't his order. Someone higher, maybe even an inquisitor, made the call. The sky split open, and the manufactorum vanished in light. The blast swallowed soldiers, rebels, civilians, all of it. The Astartes stood motionless as the shockwave hit, their silhouettes framed in white fire. It was supposed to look holy. It looked like surrender. After the light faded, nothing moved. The air shimmered with heat. The captain's armor was scorched but unbroken. He turned toward us, the mortals who had followed him through hell, and said, "The Emperor's work is done here." I don't know what answer he expected. None of us spoke. Later, as we dug through the ruins for survivors, I found a child, burned, half dead, clutching a piece of ceramite painted blue, a fragment of that same perfect armor. She wasn't crying, just staring at the sky with that hollow look that comes after belief runs out. I wanted to tell her it wasn't the Astartes' fault. That this was war, that the Emperor had a plan, that there was still meaning in all this ash. But the words died in my throat, because I didn't believe them anymore. That night, the Marines gathered in silence. No victory chants, no hymns, just maintenance. They cleaned their weapons, polished their armor, prepared for the next world. The captain didn't pray. He stared into the flame of a Prometheum torch until it died. And in that dying light I saw the truth I wasn't supposed to see. The angels of death aren't holy. They're tired. Tired of being perfect. Tired of being worshipped. Tired of killing in the name of a god who never answers. I think that's why the galaxy fears them. Not because they're invincible, but because one day they might stop pretending they are. And the moment they do, the entire Imperium will remember what real fear feels like. I stopped wearing my aquila after Vask's reach. It wasn't defiance, not yet. It just felt dishonest to wear a symbol that meant nothing anymore. I kept it wrapped in cloth, tucked into my pack like a confession I wasn't ready to speak aloud. The others noticed, of course. They always notice. But no one said anything, not out of loyalty, out of exhaustion. When faith starts to rot, it doesn't explode. It decays quietly beneath the armor plates. We were redeployed to a supply world called Forge. It wasn't a battlefield yet. It was worse, a world waiting to become one. The Astartes had been stationed there months earlier to oversee production quotas, inspire efficiency, the decree said. What they actually inspired was fear. The forges ran 20-hour cycles. Workers dropped dead at their stations. Anyone who fell behind was declared non-compliant and offered to the reclamation furnaces as penance. When our regiment arrived, we were told to reinforce morale. The kind of order that sounds like satire if you still have a sense of humor left. The angels didn't speak to us. They didn't need to. Their presence was a sermon no one could interrupt. Every time they walked the factory halls, production rates spiked. Not from inspiration, but panic. You could smell it. Even the servitors twitched faster. One night, I watched from the catwalk as a marine in black armor inspected a conveyor line. A worker, a girl, maybe 17, made the mistake of slowing to wipe sweat from her eyes. The marine's gauntlet caught her by the throat and lifted her clean off the ground. No hesitation, no emotion, just enforcement. She didn't scream. Her eyes bulged, her feet kicked once, twice, then stopped. The marine dropped her body into the forge chute without a word. The guards around me didn't move. One muttered a prayer. Another crossed himself with shaking fingers. I just stared, because I realized in that moment that this wasn't corruption. It wasn't madness. It was obedience. The next day, we found the marine at the main spire, speaking to a tech priest. They were discussing output deficiencies. The same hands that had just murdered a worker now pointed at data slates, calmly calculating how many more units could be produced if redundant flesh were removed from the process. That's when it hit me. The Astartes aren't soldiers anymore. They're administrators of death. Efficiency made manifest. The Imperium's perfect machine spirits given muscle and a conscience that's been lobotomized by faith. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air vents howled with recycled smoke. I kept hearing her choking, kept seeing the way her body went limp, not just from pain but from acceptance. Like she'd known this was how it had to end. I started writing things down, not in a report, in a notebook, old paper smuggled from the forges. I wrote every contradiction I could remember, the prayers said over lasguns that never hit their mark, the blessings poured on bullets meant for starving men, the way the Emperor's name echoed through every execution order. I didn't know why I was doing it. Maybe I just wanted proof that I wasn't crazy, that someone else might read it someday and understand. A few days later, the captain summoned me. I didn't even know he knew my name. He stood in the center of the assembly hall, tall, perfect, silent. Behind him, the forge fires painted his armor in red and gold, like some mockery of divinity. "You've been seen," he said. His voice was calm, not angry, just disappointed. "Shin?" I asked. He turned slightly, the light catching the scar across his pauldron. "Writing," he said. Words of doubt, a dangerous indulgence. And my mouth went dry. "You read it?" "No," he said. "But I don't need to. Men only write when belief begins to die." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the forges grinding in the distance, the endless hum of a world eating itself alive. Then he stepped closer. His eyes behind the lenses were pale. The kind of pale that comes from seeing too much and feeling too little. "Do you know what happens to men who lose faith?" he asked. I wanted to say yes, that they burn, that they vanish into footnotes. But I didn't. I just looked up at him and said, "They start telling the truth." Something flickered in his face then. Not rage, something worse. Understanding. He turned away. "Burn your notes," he said finally. "Forget what you think you've seen. Faith is not a luxury, soldier. It's survival." He walked away without looking back. I didn't burn the notes. The next morning, half the regiment was reassigned off-world. Efficiency restructuring, the administratum called it. Bray was among them. The boy too. I never saw either again. Maybe they were sent to another front. Maybe they weren't. That night, while patrolling the perimeter, I saw the captain again. He stood at the edge of the landing pad, staring at the stars like he was trying to remember what they were. His bolt gun hung loose at his side, no prayer on his lips, no command on his vox, just silence, and for the first time, I thought he looked human. But that scared me more than anything else, because if even the Emperor's angels were starting to doubt, then maybe the galaxy wasn't dying. Maybe it was waking up. Maybe it was waking up. I felt it in the air the next morning, a kind of quiet static that didn't come from machines, No alarms, no orders, just unease. The kind that crawls under your flak like cold sweat. Even the Astartes moved differently, slower, as if the weight of something unseen had settled on them overnight. They said nothing, of course. Angels never do, but silence can be louder than any sermon. By the fourth day, word began to spread. Small things passed in whispers between Vox, static and meal rations. A rumor that a librarian in another detachment had gone rogue, burned his own armor, and walked naked into the forge fires, laughing that he could feel the Emperor's pulse again. Someone else claimed a tech priest on Mars had started praying to logic itself. You hear enough of those stories and start to wonder if heresy isn't spreading at all, but surfacing. That night, I found 3 of my squad mates sitting in the maintenance bay, their lasguns uncleaned, their eyes hollow. Braze replacement, some recruit barely old enough to shave, was tracing the Imperial Aquila into the grime on the floor. "It's supposed to mean hope," he said quietly, "but I think it's just 2 heads eating each other." No one corrected him. Later, during a supply check, I crossed paths with the captain again. He was alone in the hangar, standing before a massive transport. His armor's blue had dulled to grey beneath the forge suit. When he turned, I realized he wasn't wearing his helmet. His face looked wrong, too human. The sort of face that's forgotten how to belong to itself. "You still carry doubt," he said, as if I'd confessed aloud. "I carry memory," I replied. He studied me for a long moment, then gestured toward the loading cranes and servitors. "They don't question, they perform. They endure. That's faith without imagination. The Imperium prefers it that way." There was no anger in his voice, just wariness. The kind that can't be trained out of a man, no matter what genome he carries. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Because you still see," he said. Most of us stopped. He turned back to the ship and paused. "You think the Emperor's watching?" I didn't answer. He smiled, small, bitter, like a heretic's prayer. "If he is, I wonder what he sees now." The next day, the captain was gone. No reassignment notice, no farewell transmission, just erased. The administratum logged it as strategic relocation, the same phrase they use for executions. That was the moment the whispers turned into something heavier. The ranks started fracturing, not in mutiny, but in thinking. Men began asking questions they shouldn't. What if loyalty doesn't mean blindness? What if obedience isn't strength? What if the Imperium isn't holy, but just old? And through all of it, the Astartes pretended not to notice. But you could feel it in the air, they did. I saw it in another Marine, one of the black, armored Deathwatch stationed on Helix Forge. He caught me during patrol, my hand brushing over a section of wall where someone had carved a message into the steel. The words were simple. The greater good is not mercy, it's survival. The Marine stared at it for a long time. His vox was muted, but his head tilted. Curiosity, maybe even recognition. Then he raised his gauntlet and scraped the words away with the edge of his blade. Not angrily. Gently, like a man burying something sacred. That was the first time I felt it clearly. The thing beneath all the faith and rot. Fear, not of heresy, not of daemons, but of the truth finally being louder than the lies. We were sent off-world a week later, new orders, new campaign, the usual rotation that keeps the Imperium spinning, never stopping long enough to look at itself. But as the transports lifted, I looked back at Helix Forge through the viewport, its forge fires still burning, feeding the endless machine. For a moment, I thought I saw the light flicker, like the world itself was holding its breath, and somewhere in that breath, between the hum of the engines and the crackle of the vox, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Doubt spreads faster than plague, and I just carried it off-world. I used to think the warp was the Imperium's greatest curse. I was wrong. It's thought. The moment you start thinking for yourself, you become more dangerous than any daemon, because daemons can be killed. Ideas can't. It started small, a glance too long, a prayer left unsaid, a word changed in a hymn. Doubt travels like heat through metal. You can't see it until it's already reshaped the blade. We were stationed on a world called Morwin's Gate, a barren planet of ash plains and dust storms, home to nothing but mining silos and faith. The ecclesiarchy ran everything there. Priests with vox amplifiers for throats, screaming sermons into the wind while people dug their own graves in the name of tithers. The Astartes presence was minimal, a a single squad of Imperial fists overseeing the construction of a new cathedral. The rest of us, mortal flesh, were there to keep the workers inspired. But there's only so long you can feed people faith before they start asking why it always tastes like blood. The rebellion didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a sermon. The head preacher climbed the pulpit one morning and began his usual litany. The emperor watches. The emperor judges. The emperor saves. But then his voice broke, just for a second, and when he spoke again, the words came out wrong. The emperor forgets. No one moved. No one breathed. The words hung there, poisonous, impossible, true. He tried to correct himself, tried to scream louder, but it was too late. The silence had already done the damage. Within a week, 3 priests had vanished. One was found dead, throat cut with a communion knife. The others were never seen again. The sermons continued, but no one listened. We just stood there, going through the motions, reciting oaths to a god who had stopped replying. I started noticing the same look in every face. Not fear, not defiance, but clarity. Like we'd all been half asleep for centuries, and were only now realizing what the dream had cost. The Astartes didn't react at first. They don't react to anything that doesn't bleed. But when production stopped, when entire work shifts began refusing to kneel, they came down from their fortress and brought judgment. We were ordered to assist. The first night, the air tasted of promethium and burning flesh. They lined the workers up in the dust, each one kneeling beneath the watch of power armor painted in gold and ochre. The captain read from the Imperial creed, voice flat as iron. Every third word was drowned out by screams. They called it purification. But as the flames spread, I saw one of the fists lower his bolter and hesitate, just for a heartbeat. The visor turned toward the bodies, then toward the cathedral's half-built spire. And for that instant, I could have sworn I saw doubt. Afterward, I found him alone near the refinery's edge, helmet off, staring into the firestorm. His face was scarred but young, too young for all that death behind his eyes. "Brother," I said. "Why?" He didn't look at me. "Because we were told to." "That's not faith," I said quietly. "That's obedience." He finally turned his head. "What's the difference?" I didn't have an answer. The next morning, the Vox channels lit up with reports of insubordination clusters, civilians refusing to rebuild, workers chanting new words in place of prayers. I caught one through the comm feed before it was scrubbed. A child's voice, trembling but sure. "The greater good is not surrender. It's survival together." That phrase again. The greater good. It had haunted me since Helis Forge. Always whispered, never explained. I'd dismissed it as Xenos nonsense once. Now I wasn't so sure. Rumors spread that the phrase came from the stars beyond Ultramar, from some alien species that didn't worship gods, didn't kneel to corpses, didn't live by hate. They said these beings fought for unity, for progress, for something bigger than themselves. Heresy, of course. Every story began with that word. But heresy starts where truth gets uncomfortable. 2 nights later, one of our own officers vanished, left his post, his gear, his rank sigil. Only thing he took was a data slate filled with transmission logs, encrypted old, some dating back to the Great Crusade. We found him the next day outside the perimeter, standing over a crater filled with burnt servo skulls. He didn't resist. Didn't even blink when they dragged him back to camp. When the interrogators questioned him, he just laughed, said he'd found something in the archives. A message from before the Emperor's rise. A voice that spoke of a humanity that built, learned, cooperated. A humanity that didn't need gods to justify its survival. They executed him that night. But before the bolt round ended him, he looked right at me and said, "You'll understand soon." They were right. The Astartes burned the crater the next morning, sealed the logs, and declared the planet purified. We were redeployed within the day. But as our dropship lifted off, I looked back at the ruins of the cathedral, half melted, still smoldering, and I swear I saw someone standing there. Not an Astartes, not a priest, a figure in armor I didn't recognize, sleek, angular, glowing faintly blue through the ash, watching. When I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. You don't talk about ghosts in the Imperium. Not unless you want to vanish like the others. But the thought followed me into orbit. It followed me into sleep. It followed me through every world we burned in the Emperor's name. And somewhere in that silence between stars, I started to wonder. What if we were the monsters in someone else's holy war? What if the Imperium wasn't humanity's salvation, but its containment? I kept writing in secret, filling my notebook with the fragments of every world we destroyed, every sermon that contradicted the last, every order that sounded less like justice and more like convenience. One night, during warp transit, the ship's lights flickered. The Jello field trembled. You could feel it, the warp pressing against the hull like a heartbeat. I sat there, staring into the dim light, and whispered to no one, "If there's something out there that still believes in reason, I want to see it." The air changed. A static hum filled the cabin. The Vox came alive, but it wasn't Imperial code, not binary, not Gothic, just a single phrase, calm and alien, whispered through distortion. "For the greater good." Then silence. The others heard nothing. The log showed no transmission, but I know what I heard. And I think I wasn't supposed to. I didn't sleep after that transmission. I couldn't. The phrase kept replaying in my skull like a corrupted Vox file, soft, measured, patient. The kind of voice that doesn't demand obedience, it invites it. That alone terrified me more than any daemon ever had. By the third day in warp transit, I'd stopped pretending nothing had happened. I started scanning the comms frequencies on my own time, hidden under the static of the ship's maintenance channels. For hours nothing, just noise and hum. But every so often, beneath the distortion, a pattern flickered through the data stream, structured, deliberate, mathematical. It wasn't random, it was communication. I cross-referenced the waveform patterns with Imperial encryption tables, not Mechanicus code, not Eldar, not even Chaos distortion the toll. It had to be. But how? We were light years deep inside Imperial territory. I didn't tell anyone. You don't report miracles in the Imperium. You bury them. Then came the dreams. They started as fragments, landscapes made of clean lines and white light, skies untouched by smoke, cities that weren't choked by incense or blood, people walking side by side, unarmed, unafraid. They didn't pray. They discussed. They didn't kneel. They reasoned. It felt alien, but not hostile. It felt possible. Every time I woke, my hands were shaking. I'd reach for my Aquila, out of reflex, and feel nothing but cold cloth. I'd unwrap it, stare at it, and wonder if it was the symbol of humanity's unity or its cage. During one shift, I found myself standing beside the ship's chapel viewport, staring at the warp glow outside. The priest approached, old, thin, half machine. His servo skull hovered at his shoulder, whispering litanies into the air. "You haven't confessed in 6 cycles," he said without turning. "I have nothing to confess." He smiled. "Everyone has something, even silence." He turned to face me, and I saw the madness that lives in all Imperial clergy, the kind born from worshipping a god who never speaks back. "Tell me," he said, "when you look at the stars, do you still see his light?" I hesitated. Too long, he saw it. The servo skull twitched, recording everything. "Yes," I lied, "always." The priest nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long before he left. That night my bunk was searched. My notebook was gone. The next morning, the ship's Vox records showed a breach in channel integrity. Someone had accessed my comm logs. They knew. I spent the next days in silence, waiting for the Inquisition to come through the bulkhead. It never did. Instead, one of the servitors left a data slate in my locker. Unsigned, unmarked, impossible. I didn't question how. I just opened it. Inside was a single message. "You are not alone. We see what you see." Coordinates followed. A world near the eastern fringe. A Tor colony system. I felt my blood go cold that night. The captain summoned me. Same one who'd warned me months ago to burn my doubts. He looked older now, worn thin by something heavier than war. His voice was low when he spoke. "You've heard them, haven't you?" I froze. He knew. "They spoke to me once," he said, stepping closer. "Before I became this. Before the armor. Before the indoctrination." He tapped his chest plate, where the Aquila had been scorched away by battle damage. "We were told they were weak. Cowards hiding behind ideals. But I saw one of their envoys once. He didn't kneel. He didn't shout. He just listened. Do you know how long it's been since I met someone in this galaxy who listened?" I couldn't breathe. The captain's eyes were hollow, but inside them flickered something rare, envy. "You think they're right?" I asked. He laughed, a sound caught between bitterness and awe. I think they're winning without firing a shot. Before I could speak again, the klaxon screamed. Warp breach. Jellifield fluctuations. Every alarm in the ship blared at once. The deck plates shuddered under my boots. Crew screamed prayers into Vox channels that only spat static back. But beneath all that chaos I heard it again, calm and hurried. Lieutenant Hale, the voice said through the comms. My name, do not fear. The storm is only the sound of change. The lights flickered red. Reality thinned around us. Shapes moved inside the walls. Familiar horrors of the warp. But they didn't reach for me. They recoiled. The voice continued. You have seen what your Imperium calls order. You have seen what your Emperor's silence creates. We offer something else. A place where faith serves life, not the other way around. I felt something move in my chest. Not faith, not corruption. Clarity. Then just as suddenly the lights returned. The alarms went silent. The breach was gone. No record of it remained. The captain was dead, vaporized by what the tech priests claimed was a field overload. I was reassigned before the body cooled. As I packed my gear, I found the same data slate waiting for me again. The same message, the same coordinates. Only now, the text had changed. You have endured long enough. Come and see. I didn't sleep. I didn't pray. I just stared at the coordinates until the numbers blurred. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew what I was going to do. The drop pod fell through silence. No warp echoes. No screaming Jellifield. Just the steady pulse of my own heartbeat and the faint hum of alien guidance systems pulling me toward a world the Imperium swore didn't exist. The coordinates from the data slate led here, a place the star maps marked as nothing but cosmic debris. But through the viewport I saw light. Clean, geometric, deliberate. The Tor don't build cathedrals. They build equations. Cities shaped like thoughts made solid. Everything moved with purpose. Every drone, every tower, every line of light humming in rhythm. It was the exact opposite of everything I'd been raised to believe was holy. And it was beautiful. When the pod hit the ground, the hatch hissed open to air that didn't burn. I stepped out into silence so profound it felt sacred. The first thing I saw wasn't a weapon. It was a child human, barefoot, laughing, running between two hovering drones that adjusted their paths to avoid her without missing formation. She looked up at me, eyes wide with curiosity. You came from the dark, she said, as if that explained everything. I wanted to speak, but words failed, because for the first time in my life, I didn't know whether I was looking at salvation or surrender. They found me soon after, fire warriors, weapons lowered. Behind them walked a figure I recognized before he even spoke. Anver, the ethereal from Vandis Prime. He looked unchanged, ageless, serene. You came far, he said softly. Most never make it past their own gods. I didn't come for faith, I said. He smiled faintly. No one ever does. They come for relief. I followed him through corridors of white alloy and living light. Humans and Tor work side by side, quietly, efficiently. No sermons. No screaming purity seals. Just intent, purpose. This is what you call the greater good, I asked. This is what we call balance, he said. The Imperium calls it heresy because it cannot control it. He stopped before a window that looked out across a valley of gardens and machines intertwined. You were taught to worship sacrifice. He continued. We teach that sacrifice is only noble when it serves the living. You were taught obedience. We teach understanding. Your emperor chained himself to a throne of light. We ask what use is a God who cannot walk among his people. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream you don't understand him. But I couldn't, because I wasn't sure I did anymore. Why me? I asked finally. Why reach out to me? Because you still believe, he said. And belief is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. You can't destroy it. You can only choose where to aim it. The words hit harder than any bolt around. Behind the ethereal, a projection shimmered to life. Images of humanity's wars, its crusades, its endless cycle of burn, rebuild, burn again. Then the voice of the Emperor, distorted, ancient, echoing through the ages. I gave them a dream. The ethereal stepped closer, eyes calm. He gave you a dream. We offer a plan. I stared at the window, at the world below, alive, ordered, breathing. The same part of me that once prayed before every battle whispered that this was wrong. But the part of me that had watched children burn in the name of faith whispered louder. I took off the ocular pendant from my neck. It felt heavier than ever. I turned it in my hand, 2 wings of metal eating each other, and let it fall. The ethereal bowed his head, not in victory, in acknowledgement. And then he said the words that would end one empire and begin something far worse. "Welcome home, Lieutenant." The lights dimmed. Outside, the city pulsed like a living organism. I could feel the hum inside my skull, soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat sensing to mine. The greater good wasn't a belief. It was an algorithm, and I had just joined the network. For a moment, I felt peace. Then I remembered what the captain once told me. They're winning without firing a shot. He was right. Because war doesn't end when you kill your enemies. It ends when you make them agree with you. I looked out at the horizon one last time and whispered a prayer that wasn't quite a prayer. "Emperor, forgive me if you still can." The sky pulsed once, half gold, half blue. And for the first time in my life, I realized maybe both colors meant the same thing. If you've made it this far, remember this: every empire begins with faith and ends with reason. The Imperium just forgot which side it's on. So ask yourself this: if the Emperor truly loved humanity, would he have burned it to save it? Subscribe and keep questioning. The next heresy might be the truth.